Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is June 18th, 2012, and my guest is Joseph Stiglitz of Columbia University. He won the Nobel Prize in 2001, and his latest book is The Price of Inequality, How Today's Divided Society Endangers Our Future. Professor Stiglitz, welcome to EconTalk.
Nice to be here.
Now, you paint a pretty bleak picture of the state of our economy, our economic system, and our political system, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about all three of those. Let's start with inequality. Why is it so disturbing? How big is it, and why is it getting worse?
Well, the United States has distinguished itself as having the highest level of inequality of any of the advanced countries. But even perhaps more disturbing is that it has become the country with the least equality of opportunity. And what that means is the chances of somebody going from the bottom to the middle, bottom to the top, or the top down, are lower than in any of the other advanced countries. The one way, an implication of that, of course, is that a child's life prospects are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in any of the other advanced countries. That should be disturbing for at least two reasons, and this comes to the general theme of the book. One is that it means that we are not using our most valuable resource, our talents of our young people, as well as we should. If you're young and you're unfortunate enough to be born of a parent who's doesn't have a good income, the chances are that you won't be able to get the education that would lead you to live up to your potential. And the second reason why it's so disturbing is that it's part of our national self-identity that we're a land of opportunity, a land of equality. And of course, we all know examples of people who've made it from the bottom to the top, immigrants who've made it. But what is relevant is not these few examples, what happens on average. And on average, we're not doing very well. And so even our sense of identity is being undermined by what's happening in the United States today.
Now, you make an important distinction there in that overview between what we might call absolute mobility and relative mobility. It is difficult in the United States, not impossible, but let's say it this way. My children have a very good economic future probably ahead of them because of the house they grew up in and the education that they're getting. To me, the more important question, and so they're going to stay, my guess, I don't know, but they have a good chance of staying in the top quintile, which is where they are now, where I am now. And I think that's true of a lot of well-educated people in professional jobs. Their kids have certain advantages from being there. To me, the fundamental question is whether people in let's say the bottom 4/5 or the bottom 99% at the extreme, whether they can get ahead. Now, by ahead can mean ahead of others, or it can just mean improving. And you paint an even bleaker picture than this picture of relative mobility. You argue that it's not just that they're not getting ahead of others, they're not getting ahead at all.
That's right. The statistics that look at how well people, what's happening to the median, people in the middle, are pretty bleak. Median household income in the United States is down to a level below 1997, a decade and a half ago. But that is only a result, as bad as it is only a result because more and more members of the household are working. So the other statistic that I find just very, very depressing is the income of a full-time male worker today is comparable to what it was in 1968, more than 4 decades ago.
That's hard to
and
believe.
And if you look at particular groups like those who don't finish college,
right,
and a increasingly large fraction of Americans are not finishing college, their prospects look even bleaker. Their incomes are actually going down significantly.
It's certainly true that if the more Americans are attending college, but not so many are finishing. But I find that 1968 number a little hard to believe. Let me make some obvious challenges to it, some of which you refer to in the book, but I want to hear your thoughts. First of all, you and I think we're both alive in 1968. I remember what 1968 roughly looked like, and this looks a lot better. And it's not just because I hang out in a rich city and hang out with rich people. The average American appears to have a much better life today than the average male than in 1968. So you start to wonder whether the data that you look at and others look at are accurate. Do they include fringe benefits? Is the measure of inflation measured correctly? Is the median distorted by demographic changes and other effects? Family size is an example of a problem. When you correct for those things, the median doesn't look so bad. The CBO's median income data has risen steadily since the late 70s. It's not dramatic. It's not as dramatic as the overall average, but you wouldn't expect it to be. What do you think of those challenges?
Well, I try to discuss those challenges in my book. Most of them, what I call, are statistical quibbling. In the end, what you can say is fairly unambiguously is that the middle has not seen increase in its income. What you see more particularly is, because the measurement errors problems are pervasive, that there is an increasing gap between the top and the middle, and that the middle has been stagnating. The top has been doing very well. And you see it in all kinds of other statistics of stress, of how people are spending their time, so I actually think that I don't want to go to the wall and say that these numbers, no set of number precisely captures what is going on and anything as complex as somebody's life. But what is clear is that things are not going well for the typical middle-class person.
That's certainly true right now, and certainly the last few years have been hard on lots of folks.
And data, by the way, that came out on last week from the Federal Reserve on what's happened to median wealth. Median wealth is a number that has some advantages over income as a measure because it isn't subjected to the year-to-year fluctuations that income is subjected to. Median wealth is back to the level of the early 90s. Whereas if median wealth in the United States had kept pace with the overall growth of wealth, you would have seen median wealth increase by 75%. So median wealth, you might say, wasn't terrible if you are a defender of the status quo. You say it wasn't terrible in 92. What do they have to complain about? It's not gotten worse than it was in 20 years.
Yeah.
But we like to think of ourselves as having progress,
yeah,
and to say that the typical family now is nowhere better off than he was 20 years ago. Wow, the rest of the economy has done enormously well, is a story of a country becoming increasingly divided.
Yeah, of course, a lot of that wealth data from the Federal Reserve, that's a very messy data set, by the way. I've looked at it in a little bit of detail. But a lot of that, of course, is housing wealth. And as housing prices rose dramatically through the late 90s and early 2000s, measured wealth went up a lot. It was on paper, and now it's back down. I presume it'll come back a little bit, but it is discouraging. And I think your point about the upper 1% or the upper levels is the one we ought to at least focus on here for a minute. When you have lots of opportunity as an economy for entrepreneurship, which the United States still does, I believe. I think the venture capital side of our economy is one of the healthier parts, and it's certainly the only healthy part of our financial system, which is something.
And it's a very small part of our economy if you look at the numbers.
It is, but it drives a lot of innovation, obviously, that affects us day to day. That part has done quite well, and I guess the question is, would you make a distinction? Let me say it a different way. When you have innovation going on in an economy, you're always going to have people who are large winners, and that's going to make the top 1% look very healthy. It's not the same people. The top 1%. LeBron James is in it now. He wasn't in it in 1992. He was very poor. Sergey Brin was a humble graduate student, and then he founded Google. The same is true of Mark Zuckerberg, a humble undergrad, maybe not so humble, but in terms of lifestyle, not ego. But you're going to see in a healthy, dynamic economy, and I would argue, probably the most innovative economy in the world. You're going to see large winners emerge. Those emerge for two reasons. One of which is they're really good at making a lot of people happy. That would be LeBron James and Sergey Brin and others who entertain us and who educate us and divert us. Then there's some people who are doing what you describe as rent seeking. They're taking money from the rest of us using the power of government. A lot of those are in the financial sector, and those I would say are bad ways that the top gets wealthy. Would you make a distinction between those two?
Yes, I would. And my concern is that disproportionately a very large fraction of those people at the top are in the second category, rent seekers. And that's precisely the point. If we had an economic system that had just the wealth creators, I think there wouldn't be this kind of attitude that there is today. The problem is that those in the financial sector who make so much money by predatory lending, abusive credit card practices, monopoly, some of the monopolists may originally have made an important contribution, but then they use their monopoly power to leverage their original contribution to get outsized, take advantage of others. And that again distorts the economy. If you look at the CEOs who take advantage of deficient rules on corporate governance to take a larger and larger share of the corporate revenues, these are all rent-seeking activities. And I think what Americans haven't realized the extent to which rent-seeking has become pervasive, and the fraction of those at the top that are who derive significant portions of their wealth from rent seeking.
And of course, there are the spillovers that occur from that. I often console myself in a not so attractive way with the fact that the large size of my salary is not merely due to my cleverness and brilliance as a teacher or an economist. Oh, that it were so. It's partly due to the fact there's been an increase in demand for economists by the financial sector, which has helped my salary indirectly. So those subsidies help me. It also, of course, happens in other areas. Doctors are a large part of the 1%. They're beneficiaries of healthcare subsidies. As you point out in the book, lawyers are a large part of the 1%. They are the benefit. They write many of the laws, and strangely enough, they benefit from them. So that raises
That's the old idea of trickle-down economics. You throw enough money at the top, everybody benefits. It's a very inefficient way of running a society. And in the end, trickle-down economics does not work for our or for any other society. If trickle-down economics really worked, then the people in the middle would be doing very well because we've thrown so much money at the top. But the fact is that while the top is doing very well, those in the middle are not. Median income today, adjusted for inflation, is the same as it was is below 1997. So it seems to me that, and this is really one of the major themes of the book, The Price of Inequality, we pay a very high price for this inefficient way of running our society. We would do a lot better if we had a set of rules, regulations, taxes that did not encourage rank seeking.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think probably where we disagree, we'll get to this later, is how to get there from here. But you see this as a fairly pervasive problem. It goes way beyond the financial sector when you talk about this. And I see it in pockets around the economy. I see the agricultural sector is a enormously rent-seeking part of our economy that's coddled by the government. The auto sector is now becoming part of that. But I see large parts that aren't that way. The retail sector is pretty competitive. The innovation sector, the high-tech sector, these are all fairly competitive. It seems to me there's issues about patents that you raised in the book. I think that's a good issue. But overall, there's a lot of innovation and competition going on in those sectors. Do you see this as a more pervasive problem for the economy as a whole, or do you see it as a more localized problem?
Well, when you go down the various sectors of our economy, we have, as you pointed out, a few very dynamic sectors, very successful sectors, the high-tech sector. But we also have a very large number of sectors that are dominated by rank-seeking, and an increasingly large, over recent years, fraction of our economy. So, and it is intertwined with almost every sector. So we talked so far about the financial sectors, the corporate governance, which gives a scope for CEOs to take an outsized share of corporate revenues, is something that occurs in a very large fraction of American enterprise, where there is insufficient, as I say, they take advantage of the deficiencies in corporate governance. You mentioned agriculture. I would also mention the energy sector, the health insurance sector.
Yep.
Actually, there are lots of, when you look down at the micro, local level, there turns out to be small rank-seeking at the local level, but writ large adds up to can add up to a significant amount. So it's very hard to quantify what is the overall fraction of rank-seeking in the economy, but I am absolutely convinced that it represents a significant fraction and is significantly distorting our economy.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I think, but you see it. I think where we differ is you see this as growing out of a deregulation, laissez-faire philosophy, and I see, of course, the exact opposite. I see the size of government growing dramatically in a number of sectors: education, health, agriculture, even the financial sector. Although there's been some deregulation, there's also been increased intervention. It's not regulation, but intervention by government to reduce the natural feedback loops that should make that sector more competitive and more of a profit and loss system where people bear costs for their mistakes. Do you see any problems with that relationship, that as government's gotten bigger, people are spending more time trying to steer it towards themselves?
Well, obviously, rent-seeking through government is a problem, and I won't deny that. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of rent-seeking in defense contractors, a lot of rent-seeking we've talked about in agriculture, but it doesn't have to be. There are some parts of government spending where there's actually relatively little rent-seeking done extraordinarily efficiently. I'm thinking of the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, NIH. So it's not an inherent property of of government, that there is this kind of rank seeking. What is inevitable, though, is that government is going to set the rules of the game. And what's disturbed me is that, as a result of our politics, that the rules of the game are being set in ways that indirectly distort our economy and create inequality. Our bankruptcy law is an example. Financial deregulation is an example. So that no economy can go without rules of the game. You have to have rules of the game. The question is, what are those rules of the game, and how are those rules of the game chosen? So what is so disturbing is that the rules of the game in the United States are chosen in ways that do not necessarily lead to a more efficient economy, but which do lead to more inequality.
I couldn't agree with you more. But for example, you complain in the book, and I'd agree with you that Dodd-Frank has been a very disappointing financial reform. But it's not surprising that it's a disappointing financial reform. The clamor for reform came from everyday people who were upset with what happened, reasonably so. But the people who spent the most time in the halls of Congress were the ones who had the biggest stake, and they were the investment banks. And as you point out, they watered down a lot of the provisions. The one that makes me the most upset is the too big to fail part. We basically still have too big to fail.
Exactly.
And so that's the way the world works. How do we get a world that's where power is not the decisive voice in political affairs? In other words, it's nice. Let me make it a starker question, because I think this is a centerpiece of your work. You've been one of the, if not the most pioneering voice for the prevalence of market failure. And I certainly agree that markets fail all the time. They're imperfect. Question is, what's better? And I don't think it's easy to make the case that government in practice is better. Government in theory is better, but has government in practice made the case that we won't have these rent-seeking and political power exploitations that you're as upset about as I am?
Well, in a way, when I was writing the book, one title that did occur to me is a paraphrase of President Clinton's campaign, "It's the economy, stupid."
Right.
It's politics, stupid. And you're absolutely right. But I guess my view is that politics doesn't have to work this way. One of the themes of the book is that economic inequality leads to inequality of political power. Inequality of political power feeds back into more inequality of economic power, that we are embarked on a vicious circle which is undermining both our politics and our economics. And so, in a way, what I'm saying is, look, we live in a democracy. We're supposed to be one person, one vote. That was the theory. We've deviated. I describe how we've become much more, almost a better description is $1, one vote. And that too, just like the outcome of the economy is a result of the rules, the specific rules that lead to outcomes that serve special interests, and exacerbate economic inequality. The rules of the political game have been leading to outcomes that exacerbate the effects of political inequality. So, in a way, I think you and I are probably on the same wavelength here. I think we need to reform some of our politics and try to identify some of the reasons that things have not worked well in politics. Maybe I'm more of an optimist. I think that we can restore democracy and make our democracy more reflective of the views of more of our citizens, and that is those reforms are what perhaps gives me the hope that I referred to at the end of the book.
Well, I like to say the Republicans and Democrats are very similar. They both like to give money to their friends. They just have different friends. but they do have one friend in common, unfortunately, which is the financial sector. And both President Obama and Mitt Romney take a lot of money from there. And that mutes their ability to speak out against it. When they do speak out against it, they reassure them privately that it's just for politics. And I think, where we certainly agree is that I think that's our biggest problem. I think you devote more space in the book to the imperfections of the financial sector and the special treatment of the financial sector than any other part of the economy. And it is a big problem. One of the points that you make that I think is inadequately made in the public media is the role that the Fed has played in subsidizing the financial sector through low interest rates and now through paying interest on deposits with the Fed, which I view as totally corrupt. What would you do with the Fed if you had your druthers?
Well, you're absolutely right that the hidden subsidies that the Fed has given, the lack of transparency has been deeply disturbing. Part of the problem that I argue on the case of Fed is that we need better governance, more transparency. I thought it was so disturbing that when Bloomberg wanted to know where the AIG money went, the Fed said it's not accountable. It doesn't have to obey the Freedom of Information Act. And then when the district court said, yes, you do, they still said, no, we don't, and appealed. And when they lost the appeal, there was actually a lot of discussion in the Fed to say, they challenged it all the way to the Supreme Court until, from what I've heard, people in administration said, you are part of the government. You can't, you have to be accountable. The way that the heads of the regional banks are appointed, with, especially in the past, a large say from the banks that they were actually supposed to be regulating, is obviously a problem with in governance. I think you need a central bank, but I think you need a central bank that's more accountable, and I think you have to have a central bank that's more representative. By that I mean it has to take into account the effects of its policy on workers, on unemployment, and right now it's I think the financial sector is disproportionately represented on the board and those who serve there. Not as bad as some other countries, but still disproportionately. And so I think I would make an explicit effort to make the Fed more representative. There are lots of qualified people who understand economics who are not beholden to the financial sector. Some of them are on the board. I think we need more.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the incentives there are not so good. I think you and I both would have agreed 5 years ago that Ben Bernanke is not beholden to the financial sector, but he has acted like every other Fed chair once he's in the chair.
This is what I describe in the book as cognitive capture.
Yep.
You spend enough time there, and you get taken by the people that you're served. And this, of course, was an old point that George Stigler made. And that's why I think you need to make sure you have some people who are less likely to suffer from that kind of cognitive capture. For instance, having maybe somebody who understands economics from the labor movement or from NGOs, people who see themselves very much as guardians against that kind of capture.
Yeah, they might be harder to capture, although you never know. I liked your point.
You never know.
I liked your point very much about cognitive capture. And I had the same thought, having been recently teaching The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. He says in there that man by his very nature wants not only to be loved, but to be lovely. That is, to be appreciated by others and to have earned it. And I think it's easy for us to convince ourselves that we are lovely. And so I'm sure that all the people on the Fed think they're doing the right thing. And that's what you refer to by cognitive capture. And as you say, if you listen to the same small circle of investment bankers on your board and others, you're certainly going to be able to convince yourself that what's good for investment banks is good for America, which is not true. By the way, when I mentioned recently at a speech at the Fed that the Fed needed more transparency, the protest from one of the employees was that we're the most transparent central bank in the world, which is really faint praise, wouldn't you say?
That's right. And actually, we've not been at the leadership. Actually, the Bank of England has really been taking more of the leadership in transparency. But one of the things that I've noticed is that they're much more stronger advocates of transparency when there's nothing to hide.
Yeah.
When they're only talking about whether they're going to increase interest rate by a quarter or lower it by a quarter. When it came to dispensing the hundreds of billions of dollars of gifts to the banking sector, which they knew were going to be politically charged, they lost their commitment to transparency.
Why do you think that one of the more embarrassing things that they did not want public was how much money they've given to foreign banks? Why do you think they did that? Not hide it, but why did they actually subsidize so many and rescue so many foreign creditors?
Well, I think some of this has to do with these banks were intimately intertwined with American banks, in many cases through CDSs, through these complicated derivatives. And that's an example of where our banks and our bank financial system remains, after Dodd-Frank, not totally transparent, far from transparent. Not long ago, there was a lot of uncertainty about what would happen when Greece restructured its debt. And no one knew, because no one knew the exposure of American banks, European banks, the Greek banks, both directly, but even more through CDSs, through these derivatives. And it was totally clear that we hadn't really fixed this lack of transparency. When you have that lack of transparency, you are you can suffer from this fear, especially generated by the banks. They'll say, if you don't bail out our partner here, he's going to fail, and then he won't be able to pay us, and then we won't be able to pay somebody else. So the banks are they're become too intertwined to fail. Again, a failure of regulation that they should have stopped, and the result that I think is at least part of the reason that we bailed out those foreign banks. It was an indirect way of bailing out our own banks without seeing the money going there.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's true. The AIG bailout, it's not a bailout of AIG, it was a bailout of Goldman Sachs.
Was the largest recipient.
I think second. I think there was I can't remember who the number one was, but they were very close.
But the foreign banks that got the money, many people suspect that one of the reasons they got money is, again, because of this intertwining with Goldman Sachs and other American banks.
Yeah, my theory, which is just speculative as to why we didn't rescue Lehman, is that many of its creditors were Japanese banks that didn't have any political voice, that didn't have those intertwinings, and it was just too bad. But who knows? That's just a speculation.
But coming back to the theme of the book, all of this leads to inequality, because those are all institutions that have payment structures in which a few people at the top walk off with millions and millions of dollars.
Hundreds of millions in some cases.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a rather, it's historically unprecedented. The transfer of public money to people who are already the richest people in human history. It's really, but let me challenge you on that, because many, many economists who feel the way you do, that is, who are worried about inequality and very much focused on that, supported these bailouts. And I understood the short-term issue, but I would have preferred paying the short-term price. The long-term price is destroying our political and economic system. But each time these bailouts occurred, and they go back to 1984 with Continental Illinois, some would say even before that, but it really starts with Continental Illinois in 84. The Mexican bailout, which was a bailout not of Mexico, but again of, I think, mostly American banks who were Mexico's creditors. all of these were supported by mainstream economists who said, well, it's not attractive. Alan Greenspan, so-called free marketer, supported the Mexican rescue, the U.S. guarantee of their next round of debt. That was all supported as quote, necessary at the time. And yet has sown the seeds for the misbehavior on the part of banks and the recklessness and the imprudence. So how do we get
I agree.
How do we get out of that?
There's a distinction that I make between saving the institution and saving the bankers, the bondholders, and the shareholders. I think it was perhaps necessary that we save some of these institutions. It was totally unnecessary that we rescue the shareholders and the bondholders and the bankers. And if we had played by the rules of capitalism, which include conservatorship, if the banks can't pay what they owe, the shareholders get wiped out, the bondholders step in. If the bondholders can't fill the breach, then the bondholders get wiped out.
Yep.
If we had played by the rules of capitalism, we would have avoided creating the kind of inequality, the system of unfairness we have. We would have a more efficient economy, and we would have contributed less to this problem that everybody recognizes now of moral hazard, because the banks realize that when they gamble, especially these too big to fail banks, if they gamble and they win, they walk off with the profits. When they lose, the taxpayer picks up the tab. I think it was unconscionable. They say that they fixed the problem. I don't know if you share my view. I think they clearly haven't.
No,
they say these living wills, these that orderly resolution. And the next crisis comes, they'll do almost the same thing that they did in the last crisis. And the reason is the bankers will scare the politicians, and they will tell them it will be the end of the world. Yep. It will be the end of the world as far as the bankers may be concerned, but it would be actually better for our economy.
Well, the main evidence for the fact that nothing has changed is that we supposedly fixed this problem in 1991, I think it was, with FDICA, the FDIC Improvement Act, which was not invoked in this crisis, even though it was on the books. But it was special circumstances.
Exactly right.
Special circumstances. The world's going to end, as you say. So, what would you suggest that we do to try to get some actual change and some accountability in the financial sector? What Milton Friedman called a profit and loss system, which would be a good idea.
Well, as we were talking before, underlying the problem is politics, and I think we're going to need to make our democracy more democratic. We're going to have campaign finance reform, do something about lobbying, something about the revolving doors, try to restore our democracy closer to one person, one vote, at least move away from $1, one vote. And I talk about some of the reforms that can be done there. I think in terms of the economics, I think most economists are fairly well agreed on the economic, on the agenda for reforming the financial sector, for instance. We have to do something about the too big to fail banks, too intertwined to fail banks. The banks, there's no reason for justification for the lack of transparency in the derivatives. There is no reason that a government-insured bank should be writing these risky products. We may have a difference about whether they're insurance or whether they're gambling products, but whatever they are, they're not loans. They're not something that ought to go within a bank. And two of the Federal Reserve governors, regional heads of the regional banks, Honig and Fisher, very much took that view, but the Geithner and Bernanke, cognitively captured by Wall Street, took the other view, and they prevailed. So I think in terms of the economic agenda of what needs to be done, I think there's a broad agreement among economists. The question is, can we get it through the politics? And here I remain pessimistic with you.
Yeah, especially when you have people coming to office as reformers, such as President Obama or President Clinton, who vowed they would have the most ethical administration of all time. Very hard to stop that revolving door. Boys, and hard to monitor. It just, I think that will always be with us.
Well, I don't think it has to be always with us. I think the issue here has to do with these political reforms, and unfortunately things have gotten worse with a set of court decisions that have seemingly given more and more power to money.
Yeah, on the optimistic side, though, you have movements on the left and the right, which would be the Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party movement, both of which agree that bank bailouts are a bad idea. So that's some hope for the future. Maybe that will pressure future politicians a little bit if those views become.
I hope so. I think this is partly where the debate can become healthy. And one of the things that I've felt good about my book is that in the discussion of the price of inequality, by focusing on some of the major sources of inequality, the rent-seeking activity, there is actually common ground between the left and the right. I think the people, and certainly among most economists who do agree with me that rent-seeking is a kind of activity that both increases inequality and weakens the economy.
Yeah, no doubt about it. My challenge, though, I think for you is that the calls for more regulation. You have to be optimistic in those calls that the story is going to unspool itself in a different way than it has in the past. That there won't be capture. That there won't be these distortions. Well,
we've been successful sometimes in the past of doing things right, and maybe I'm a Midwesterner, and maybe it's my Midwestern optimism that comes forward. But in the aftermath of aftermath of the Great Depression, we did pass Glass-Steagall, and Glass-Steagall did serve to stabilize our financial system for decades. We didn't have a financial crisis for decades. It was only as we began to strip away the regulations that we began to have more and more crises. Of course, as times changes, you're going to have to change the regulatory structure. So the real issue was, could we have changed that regulatory structure to adapt it to the changing technology, changing economy? I believe we could have, but obviously the deregulation movement, particularly that took place in the 80s in the financial sector, and then continued under President Clinton, didn't go in that direction.
Yeah. And we have, you could make the same story about our housing policies, right? Post-World War II, post-Great Depression, Fannie Mae seemed to be a useful part of housing finance, but in it lay a not very healthy set of incentives that inevitably cause problems. It's interesting.
That's right.
It's interesting how long it took, right? It's interesting how long it took, but inherently, and you can say the same thing about Social Security. It worked great when demographics were in its favor, but probably has to change.
Well, let me say on the housing thing that the critical mistake we made came out, you might say, in governance when we privatized it in 1968.
Yep.
And we didn't clarify the extent to which it was or was not a government institution, even though it was privatized. And then we allowed it to get too big to fail, to go back to one of the things we've talked about before. I don't think, whether it was private or public, we would have bailed it out because it was too big to fail. And it knew it was too big to fail. What happened under a series of heads is it lost its mission. Remember, its mission was for conforming loans for typical Americans. It wasn't for the people at the bottom. There was a separate agency for that.
Or the top, by the way, which it also, or the top. In the last 10 years, it got increasingly involved in both the bottom and the top.
That's right, but if it had kept with its mission of conforming loans, as they were called,
right,
it would not have gotten into the problems. The difficulty was it was a private sector. It had been privatized, and the CEOs got jealous, I think, of the profits that were being made of the CEOs in other financial institutions, and said, we can do everything that they can do, and maybe even better. We're even bigger, and we're even more too big to fail. And of course they did that, and of course they did fail.
Yeah,
the government came to the rescue.
And it became a useful tool for politicians to push them in directions that I think they were very happy to be pushed, because it allowed them in the short run to make a lot more money lending outside those conforming loans. Let's turn to the economy as a whole. You have been a outspoken advocate for stimulus, and the effectiveness of stimulus. I'm a skeptic. Tell me why you think the stimulus was successful and what you think we ought to be doing now, whether, regardless of whether it was successful or not. Where are we at?
Well, in evaluating whether it was or was not successful, the difficulty is what we economists call the counterfactual, what would otherwise have been. And I am convinced that had it not been for the stimulus, unemployment would have peaked at 12 to 13%. As it was, it peaked at 10%. That's terrible, but the stimulus was simply not large enough, was not well enough designed, was not of long enough duration to really address our country's problem. The underlying problem was lack of demand. Lack of demand caused by several factors. 40% of all investment before the crisis was in real estate. With the breaking of the bubble, that went. The average savings rate in the United States was 0. That was not sustainable. With the breaking of the bubble, savings soared to 4 or 5%. Not going to return back to where it was, perhaps ever, because that was an abnormality. But you took away two of the major sources of demand. With demand that weak, something had to fill it in. It's not going to be investment when consumption is so weak. It's not going to be exports when our trading partners are so weak. And so the only thing to fill it in is government stimulus. Now, well-designed government stimulus, investments in technology, infrastructure, education, yielding high returns, more than pay back the cost of borrowing. Right now, the cost of borrowing short is 0, long is 1.5%. If we could borrow, if a firm could borrow at those interest rates and have returns on investments comparable to what we can get in the public sector, it would be foolish not to do it. When I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, we did a study of the returns that we got from social and returns that we got from investments in R&D, and they were phenomenal. We didn't win every project, but if we had, we would have been a sign that we weren't undertaking enough risk. But the average return from government investment projects in technology were actually huge, and no risk that we're not being able to repay the amount that we borrow. So in my mind, right now, given our underlying problems of inequality, which is weakening our economy because as you move money from the bottom to the top, total demand goes down, given our necessity of a structural transformation to adapt the economy, move it away from manufacturing towards economy of the 21st century, the only way we are going to make this successful transition and recover will be through some form of government stimulus.
So
monetary policy is not going to work.
Well,
and
some would say
we know.
Well, some would say we haven't tried it.
It's the one option.
Some would say we haven't tried it, but let's leave monetary.
You're not going to lower short-term interest rates below zero.
No, but you can still. You can
long-term interest rates at 1.5%. In fact, we tried QE1, QE2, and there's a good theoretical reason why, in a world of globalization, monetary policy isn't going to work. You provide liquidity in a world of globalization, the money goes to where the returns are highest. And right now, the returns are highest in the emerging markets that are dynamic, not in the American economy that's moribund.
Yeah, but if you make those investments, you gain those benefits wherever you invest them, and those resources are going to still be available here. I think it's an open question whether. Well,
we've tried it. I don't think it's an open question. I think we've tried it, and we've seen what's happened. I mean, basically, why should we expect it to work? You provide liquidity out there, and the money, the global marketplace out there, and it's going to go where they think the returns are highest. The returns in a private sense, not the social sense. Each firm is looking at what its private returns are, where its private returns are highest. American companies are saying, okay, I can produce more cheaply abroad, tax advantages of moving my companies abroad, and bring the goods back to the United States, create the jobs abroad, sell the goods in America. Of course, right now they can't sell the goods in America because the economy is not doing very well. But
consumption spending is still very high. Consumption spending is very
still high, but it wasn't like it was.
I think it's back. I haven't looked at it lately, but I think it's back. I think it's above its 2007 peak. But,
yeah, I know. But in a half a decade, if we're going to have a strong enough economy to find jobs for the new entrants in the labor force, that's not good enough.
Well, I agree with that. At least I agree we're not doing well enough to take care of those folks. Let's go back to the fiscal side and the stimulus side. You argue that in the absence of the stimulus, we would have had a much higher unemployment rate. But of course, the proponents of the stimulus at the time said that would not happen. They said that if we didn't have stimulus, the counterfactual would be unemployment would reach 8.5%. I think was the fear. If we did not,
the problem. I mean, I agree. Obama's team made a critical error in underestimating the severity of the downturn and the employment effects. In my book Freefall, I try to explain why I was not surprised that they had underestimated. I mean, after all, the Obama economics team included some of the people that were the deregulators, that were the people who were supposed to be supervising the New York banks, the people who wrote whose achievement was to give unbridled deregulation to derivatives. So they didn't want to admit that they had really messed up. They didn't want to admit that the financial sector had really messed up the economy so badly. So I think they had an ingrained incentive to try to minimize the scope of the economic downturn. And that was politically and economically a major mistake on the Obama administration. I was always much more pessimistic about where the economy was going.
Well, it was clearly...
what I was talking about is not complicated economics. I just saw the magnitude of what was going on in housing. They were trying to pretend the housing problem was not significant. I thought the housing prices were going to go down. Turned out I was right. They went down by more than 30%. I thought consumption was going to go down because the savings rate of 0 was not sustainable. Again, it was right. I find it unbelievable that they misestimated as badly as they did, but that doesn't answer the question whether the stimulus worked. The fact that they had not taken correct assessment of the economy doesn't mean that they weren't right about what we call the delta, what the extra effect of the government spending would be.
Yeah. The problem, though, is that it's always easy. You were right, let's say. There's always some people who are right ex ante. There's always many who are wrong who ex post can tell a story as to why they were right anyway. Right? At the time, Alan Blinder, who is as accomplished Keynesian as academic Keynesian as there is, did a calculation to claim that it was just about perfectly sized. Others said it was too small. Those that you and Paul Krugman. Others said it was way too large. And the problem I have, and I'll raise this as more of a philosophical question than a particular question about the mess we're in. I don't see any really useful way to evaluate those different claims. The CBO, which is not.
Well, let me tell you. See, the framework that I had argued for at the time of the crisis recognized that there's going to be differences of opinion and uncertainty. I mean, obviously, I thought I was right, but I had to recognize that there were other people who had different models with different views, and I, try as I could. I couldn't always persuade all of them. So what I said is the following: let's have some programs which are automatic stabilizers. What do I mean by automatic stabilizers? Policies that would spend more money if the unemployment rate remained high, like stronger unemployment benefits, but would diminish if the unemployment rate came down. Another example, I was very worried from the beginning about the states and localities, because I've seen this before. State and localities have balanced budget frameworks, especially with the property tax being so important at the state and local level. Property values going down, I estimated by a lot. Bob Scholler estimated by a lot. That meant that tax revenues were going to go down. That was going to mean cutbacks in expenditure. That was going to mean weakening of the economy, unnecessary layoffs of teachers, firemen, policemen. So I said, let's have a program that will fill in the gap if tax revenues go down in the way that I anticipated. But if it didn't go down, we wouldn't have to fill it in because the economy was strong. We wouldn't have to fill it in. So that was a way that we could have squared the circle. We could have said, okay, if I'm right, we're going to have to spend a lot of money on these programs. If you're right, the economy is not weak, we won't spend the money. I'm just as happy not spending the money if we don't need it. But unfortunately, the Obama administration and Congress would not adopt these automatic stabilizers.
Well, they did a little bit.
A little bit, but not much.
They've continued to extend unemployment insurance.
But they really only extended for a limited duration of time, and now we're facing a problem that many people have run out of unemployment benefits. People have looked for a job and looked and can't find one, we didn't do anything about the states and localities. And the result of that is, of course, that public sector employees are now 1 million lower than they were in 2007. And these cutbacks are exacerbating the downturn.
No, I'm not sure. You think they're 1 million lower than 2007?
Yeah, the combination of state, federal, and local are just the numbers I've seen are about 1 million lower, 3/4 of that at the state and local level.
Yeah. There has been a small cutback from the peak. I don't think the peak was 07, though. I think the peak, let me just say.
It may have been 08, but from whatever it was, the peak, it's 1 million down.
Okay, well, we'll post.
I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it's significant.
I'll post those. We'll put a link up to the data when I'll find a source, or you can send me a source. We'll check that.
Sure.
But let me come back to this philosophical question. If you look at the CBO estimates of the effect of the stimulus, which are not actual estimates, but are rather just recalibrating the model for the actual amount that was spent, their effect on employment is a 6-fold range. That is, when they say, well, the third quarter of 2011, so many jobs were created. This is, again, not an estimate based on the actual data, but rather a forecast, essentially a forecast using the amount of money that was spent. The range that they provide to show that they're scientific is 6-fold. That is, the high end estimate is 6 times the low end estimate. It's not very precise. And if you look at the survey of multipliers that Valerie Ramey, and she was a guest on this program recently talking about, the range is enormous. And obviously that's a result of the complexity of our economic system and the challenge of scientifically figuring out what the right specification is for estimating these. If you're a interventionist, you find a big multiplier. If you're a laissez-faire, less interventionist person, you find a small multiplier. Strangely enough, you confirm your...
The problem is particularly difficult right now, and for the following reason. We don't have deep downturns, fortunately, very often.
Correct.
The last time we had a deep downturn, anything near this, was the Great Depression, and the world has obviously changed a lot in 80 years. Many of the studies of multipliers, most of the studies of multipliers, are focused on, in fact, I would say all the studies of multipliers are focused on situations where the unemployment rate is much lower. Many of the poorly done studies of multipliers include periods in which we have full employment, i.e., no significant unemployment. Those are totally deceptive in terms of analyzing the multiplier, because we know, there's no disagreement among economists that if the economy is at full employment and you spend more on government, something's going to give, because you can't increase the size of the pie. You're not going to increase employment very significantly. And so you're just displacing, the government spends more, the Fed is going to raise interest rate, investment is going to go down, something else is going to have to give. And so in that kind of a world, a zero multiplier or even a negative multiplier is possible, because you're disturbing the equilibrium. So the fact that a lot of the time you have a zero multiplier says absolutely nothing about the current situation. And what a experience where we had 3-4% unemployment or 5% unemployment says about a situation where you've had prolonged unemployment of over 7%, again, is of some question. So that's, in my mind, the fundamental flaw in most of those econometric studies. Now, the difficulty is, what do?
Yeah.
Because we don't have the data.
Yeah.
And that's where I keep coming back to, we have to have flexibility. We have to use things like automatic stabilizers. We have to, what we need to do is, so long as we can stimulate the economy in any way we can to get back to full employment, we ought to be doing that, because the price that we're going to pay is going to be very high. We're going to pay a price of our inequality. When you have this high unemployment, wages get bid down, social services get cut back, investment in education gets cut back, is going on today. And so we get more inequality, and we are putting in jeopardy our economy today and our economy in the future.
And it's especially hard on people with less education. This is about a threefold
very much harder on those people.
Threefold difference in unemployment rate among people without a high school diploma and those who have college degrees. It's a brutal situation. The question is, how do we make it better? And I think just to sum up, you're very critical of Milton Friedman in your book and his philosophy. It's a philosophy I basically subscribe to, which is a philosophy of smaller government, because I don't trust those the feedback loops that regulators put in. You're more optimistic about that. I'm more optimistic about the ability of the private economy to create opportunity. I look at, as you mentioned earlier, I look at immigrants who come here. They seem to thrive. I think if you get a college degree and you study something serious, and there's tremendous access to college now, that may not last because the loan programs may be troubled. But I see a half full glass. You see half empty to a large extent. Let's close. Why don't you talk about why you're optimistic and where you think, not where you'd like us to go, but where you think we're going that is encouraging. Say something cheerful. Your book's very depressing. It's very
yes. Well, things are depressing, and a lot of my book is trying to prevent us from things getting worse. That America, I think, in some ways has lost extreme. What you say is right, that we've had moments where we've given opportunity, that people have made it ahead, that we have great universities, we have great innovation, but the data are looking more and more bleak. That access to education, access to opportunity is declining. The chance of somebody from the bottom making it to the middle, to the top, is lower than even in old ossified Europe. If we don't do something, we won't be able to compete in the global marketplace. So what I'm trying to argue is that we are paying a very high price. We have a very high level of inequality, a higher level than most Americans realize, a lower level of equality of opportunity, lower than most Americans realize. But that we can't pull back. It's not that hard. And that's the moment of optimism that I'd like to say. You know, in other moments where we face this level of inequality, we have pulled back from the brink. This is not the first time we face these unbridled levels of inequality. The Gilded Age, the Roaring '20s, each of those instances we pulled back from the brink. We had the Progressive Era, we had the social legislation of the '30s, and the optimism is that if we can only grasp the challenges that we're facing, understand the way things are going, then realize that we can have a more equal society and a more dynamic economy, that the two can go together. Then, of course, we will be laying the foundations for a future shared prosperity. And that's what I'd like to see, a shared prosperity where all parts of our country do well together.
My guest today has been Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz, thank you for being part of EconTalk.
Well, thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.